would watch. I'd like to welcome everyone to the conference. We're going to give it another minute here as we're seeing other participants that are just joining. So we'll give them a minute. Okay, we're going to kick it off here. My name is Shelley Sopier. I am with AblePay Health. I am the RE3 for Region 8, and we'll be moderating the Region 8 webinar today. And we're excited to have Aspirion joining us today and transforming out-of-network claims into revenue engines. And I would like to introduce our speakers here. We will be asking everyone to hold your questions till the end. We will have a Q&A session. If you do have specific questions that come up, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and then making sure we ask all the questions at the end that are not answered during the presentation. And so I'd like our speakers, Seth, to kick us off with introducing himself.
Not a problem, thank you. My name's Seth Ford. I'm the Revenue Cycle Manager for Pre-Litigation and Payer Relations at Kaiser Permanente. I'm on the Kaiser Foundation Hospital side of the Trinity of Kaiser Permanente. So I'm here to give a provider perspective on this. I've been with Kaiser Permanente for 5 years and have about 15 years of experience in the nexus between litigation and insurance collections.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Seth. So I'm Leanna Hamilton. I'm the General Manager of Payment Variance here at Aspirion. I've spent my entire career in the zero balance recovery space. So I started my career with Triage Consulting Group. I spent 14 years there before founding Boost Healthcare in 2013, also focused on zero balance recovery. So back in 2021, when I saw the No Surprise Act coming through the pipeline, I realized in the zero balance space that if we didn't get our arms around it, we'd be sitting on a whole pile of unrecoverable zero balance claims. So we dug in, rolled up our sleeves, and tried to figure this out. So I'll pass it to Seth.
All right. So before we dig in further, it's good to level set for what the No Surprises Act is in this space. So it's abbreviated here as NSA. I also interchangeably use the House resolution, which is HR 133. So you'll see me flip between NSA and HR 133. Like a lot of things in our industry, it is acronym abundant. So in essence, what is it? Well, it's to provide federal protection for patients from surprise medical bills, especially in situations where the patients may not have had choice in what happened. So this specifically involves emergency care, um, when a patient gets transported to an ER that's not in network, um, when out of network providers are providing care at a patient's in network facility, and also air ambulance as well. The protection for the patients are that the patients are paying or limited to only their in network cost share, not out of network cost share, and no balance billing is allowed. In terms of the impact, especially for out of network providers, um, the payment rate that is established is called the qualifying payment amount, or QPA. The QPA is really just It's the median contracted rate of the charges of your services amongst your geographic peers. Notice median contracted, that's always a nice complication when you're non-contracted. As it was as of January 31st, 2019, and then adjusted for inflation. So what this does is it often results in reduced payments up front, especially for non-contracted providers, as opposed to a higher level of a payment. So providers are often absorbing the cost differences through this new reimbursement process. So NSA creates out-of-network payment challenges. If you're getting lower payments up front, that leads to cash flow problems, further payment delays. We'll see a little bit of that when we walk through the actual dispute process laid out in HR 133. It leads to administrative burden and compliance costs. Namely, if you go to the end and pursue IDR, which is informal dispute resolution, which is a baseball-like arbitration. Dispute resolution challenges toward the end, referred there, and already referred to the reimbursement rate reductions that can happen upfront if you're non-contracted and you pursue the dispute process to get more. All right, so the next few slides, we're looking at information put together by the Kaiser Family Foundation, no relation, pulling from data published by CMS that is publicly available on their website, tracking IDR and open negotiation outcomes from 2020. I think they have 2023 and a large portion of 2024 published. This site, this chart is showing the outcomes. It's not total, it's just what's published. The outcomes in favor of the facility and in favor of the plan for the second year of the NSA and the first half of the third year of the NSA. And so what you can see here is it starts out pretty favorable to the providers in terms of IDR determinations. What does that mean? That means where the arbitrator, called the IDRE, Informal Dispute Resolution Entity, let's just call them an arbitrator, has determined for the provider's offer or their QPA rate. So basically, pay what the provider wanted. That increases over time to where it's kind of stabilized in the range, at least in middle 2024, stabilized in the range of 80% of the time. Providers are winning in this public data. But here's what's interesting. Non-contracted payers are reimbursing at around 10 to 15% of bill charges, at least in initial payment, outside of this dispute process. Well under the more normal pre-NSA commercial payer levels of 50 to 80% of charges. Your mileage may vary there, and that's well below what even Medicaid pays. Think about that for a moment. You're potentially accepting payments that are worse than Medicaid rates. Would you accept that in any other context?
And I have to say, looking at the 80% win rate in favor of the providers, facilities filing these IDRs or these disputes, that's a pretty compelling case to get those filed. It's worth your time. It can be a revenue engine. So as we saw, while providers are winning the majority or over 80% of the IDRs, these are the top 10 initiating, the top 10 initiating parties for the IDR process. Here you can see are kind of some smaller groups that are private equity backed. So they're in the business of making money. So they realize this is a revenue engine. So they are participating. they are filing those IDRs. I don't see a lot of those hospital groups here. So we want to see more providers, more hospitals. I will say we'll get into it further along. I do think the complexity of the claims in those environments, like a radiology partners, are not as complex. It's probably a lot easier to put together an arbitration and an agreement to submit. However, I think this does paint the picture that this is worth your time. This is a revenue engine. So what our partners are experiencing. So the NSA was designed to protect patients from large surprise bills. However, it inadvertently created a loophole for non-contracted payers to reimburse far below customary commercial rates, as we've seen. So we're seeing, average reimbursement in 10, 15% of bill charges, sometimes 6%, just well under contracted commercial payer levels of, that 50, 80% range. And as we mentioned, even below what Medicaid, and that's just not acceptable. Anything below Medicare, anything below Medicaid in a commercial space, a commercial payer environment is not appropriate, as we all know. So this also, the real issue here is this also disincentivizes payers to contract with providers as well. So without a system to contest low payments, the hospital is really, you're locking in the potential to receive subpar reimbursement moving forward. So what's the incentive? Why should they contract it? So would you really accept this in any other context? I doubt it. So really the question comes down to is not whether can you afford to invest in a strategic out of network approach, it's whether you can afford not to. So we have millions of dollars on the table. The data shows that overwhelmingly providers win these disputes and they're being paid well below commercial rates. So it's time to act. It's time to create this revenue engine.
This is a question we asked ourselves at Kaiser, and our answer was no, we can't afford not to. By the third year of the NSA, Kaiser Foundation Hospitals was experiencing a decrease of approximately 14% payment to charges in its commercial non-KP payer insurance payments for the California market compared to 2021. All right, so today we're going to discuss, after that level set, we're going to discuss 5 strategies to transform out-of-network claims into revenue engines. And it starts with identifying the claims themselves, the affected claims. NSA provides for remark or CART codes that are supposed to label these claims to minimize guessing. Second is to track deadlines with precision. The whole dispute resolution process is a quasi-legal one meant to be a streamlined arbitration. So having calendar management becomes very important. Customize payer playbooks. Just like with any other follow-up insurance, payer behavior is different based upon the payer. Tracking that becomes essential. 4, leverage IDR outcomes systemically. One element of that is to track your outcomes with IDREs or the arbitrators. What's the success rate over one over another? Another part might be to help you in negotiating contracts or prices if that's the way you want to move forward as a provider. And 5, evaluate your build, buy, and partner decisions into helping you capitalize on this area.
So that first strategy really is the most challenging, claim identification. So the reality is for healthcare providers, claims are piling up faster than teams can process them. And there's a lot of gray areas as to how to identify them. So the biggest challenge we see is just where are these claims? Where are they hiding? And why can't we automate this? Why can't we identify them? Well, we're seeing that remit codes are just not consistently included on all of the NSA eligible claims. We've even seen a remit code that said QPA versus the appropriate remit code.
Yeah,
Um,
I've seen that in some paper scenarios. Sometimes it's the difference between paper and electronic, and sometimes it's disclosed in what's the EOB sent to the patient, but not necessarily what's sent to the provider.
Yep. And we're also seeing that provider systems aren't configured to recognize all the relevant codes. So they're just not configured to pick that up and automatically put it into a work queue, for example. And again, just varying interpretations, varying ways that payers are hiding this. There's also, they tend to not be the highest volume at all in your claims volumes. So really it's a small volume of claims traditionally. We usually start with just taking a big dump of generic commercial and digging through a lot of those payer classes just to identify which ones are out of network. As I mentioned, they can be really small volume, um, and just again, difficult to not only identify, but to automate the identification of these claims.
So another kind of level set moment before we talk or discuss calendar management, it's helpful to kind of understand the overarching timeline of dispute laid out by the NSA. Um, in general, you can just see on the chart that it can take, ideally, it's planned, if it's working in ideal circumstances set out in the law, takes somewhere between 180 to 200 calendar days to resolve. Um, as in many things in life, not everything's ideal. A lot of the deadlines in this law are based upon business days, so I'm just going to say days from now on, but you should assume from this point that when I'm talking about days, I'm just talking about business days, not calendar days. So part of the reason that claim identification is so important for the dispute process is, like a lot of things, your clock starts running with the receipt of the EOB, of the marked EOB. You receive that payment that's marked with an HR 133 NSA CART code. That's when the clock starts running. You have 30 business days to reach out and initiate open negotiation with the payer that sent that. Open negotiation is intended to be just an informal settlement agreement, one off, that you reach out with the provider. Hopefully, they're supposed to establish their own uh, email or process where that can go. That was a bit more chaotic in the first year or two of this process. Now, a lot of the major payers do have email addresses established to go through that. So once you send that notice, there's another 30 business days to allow for that negotiation. I think originally this was envisioned for people to rapidly spitball uh, numbers and come to the settlement, sign off, and everybody moves on with their life. Um, that may or may not be what happens if if a settlement is not reached or someone's just unresponsive. You have 4 business days from the end of that time to file for informal dispute resolution on the CMS website. You also have to provide documentation that you engaged in open negotiation, and that website will kick you out if your deadlines are not right. So once you do that, once you file, there's a small objection period where the payer can object to this being even eligible. Then in 10 business days, you select your arbitrator, or your IDRE, they call it. And in theory, once all that's done, the IDRE has 30 business days to come to a decision. We're not there yet. We're getting better as an industry, but it's not usually at that level. Um, and because it's a baseball-like arbitration, there's no testimony, there are no attorneys arguing. You submit your last best offer, the payer submits their last best offer, and the IDRE chooses between the two. And whoever wins gets their fees refunded back. And in theory, the loser is supposed to pay within 30 days of that determination. And that's the overall timeline. It's very much like a accelerated form quasi-legal process.
So as Seth mentioned, that 30-day window, 30 just really starts ticking the second that EOB hits and posts. So as we know, that's a very short time frame, especially when we're having challenges just identifying these claims in the first place. So a lot of times they're just hitting that adjustment unrecoverable because it was too late, lost that 30-day window. And sometimes it's just about finding the right place to send it to. So it may be Blue Cross of Illinois versus Blue Cross of Oregon. You really have to do your research into getting it to the right place. Not only that, the right department. So really all of these deadlines are tricky every step of the way. And what we found is that we had to create our own workflow tool just to be able to track and manage all of them with alert systems, workflows. The things that we're having to track in this environment are, negotiation submission starts and ends. We track that kind of that spitballing that Seth referred to. Offer 1, what was offer 2, offer 3. All of this is in our workflow tool. Otherwise, we would have no way to track it all. Then we have to track the IDR eligible dates. So have we not come to an agreement in the single case environment? Okay, when does the IDR, when do we file for the IDR? We're then also tracking the IDR entity that has been chosen. And so we know where to go, which arbiter, which third party will be hearing our case, so to speak. And then I know I've heard this in the provider community, sometimes just making sure that you meet those IDR fees and timelines is tricky as well. So that's something else we're tracking. So
I
you
didn't even mention that earlier. Yeah, if you don't pay up front, it doesn't go anywhere. That is the added cost here. Is it may be cheaper than normal arbitration, but you're still spending anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 per filing.
That's right. And so you have to pay those IDR fees within 7 to 10 days or you time out. So that's something else that we've had to track, as well as arm our team with credit cards just to ensure that those payments were made timely. Because again, that was one more step of the way where you can be timed out and you've lost the opportunity. And then ultimately in our workflow tool, we're tracking by disposition number. So a disposition number is assigned to the case and like a case number. And it really, at that point, the account number becomes irrelevant in this process. Everything is really tied to the disposition number as far as the IDR goes, the fees, the entity, and tracking, et cetera. So there's just a lot here that I think is really difficult to track in your typical, we'll call it Epic or EMR system that I know providers use for the majority of revenue cycle day to day.
Almost reminds me of moving back to more like law firm calendar management systems or softwares or accounting that way. It's not quite as simple as just deferring and then coming back in a work queue.
So as Seth mentioned, this is really, a legal case. So we want to put our best foot forward. So in the single case agreement, we need to come up with our demand letter or appeal negotiation letter, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's where in the simpler environments that we saw, like Radiology Partners, it's a lot simpler to generate this letter because you have very limited services. It'd probably be a lot easier to kind of create a canned letter. In the hospital environment, it's a lot more complex. We really need to review the chart notes. We need to take into the account the acuity of the case and various clinical elements. And so that's where we had to bring in an AI tool. So Aspirion uses DocIQ for their denials product. We were able to create another version of it for this appeal generation in the out-of-network environment. And this dramatically helped with our ability to get these letters back to the payers because we're winning. There's money here, and we were at that point kind of limited to a certain dollar amounts and strengths of case. But with this tool, it was able to take up about, we were spending about 75% of our time, I would say, on this part of the process, and it dramatically reduced that. So that enabled us to go lower and lower dollar on these out-of-network cases.
I think showing like the next slide for what's typically needed will drive that knowledge bit home there.
Yep, exactly. So what we were able to also program in there is kind of what the arbiter is taking into account when they're determining what your QPA is, and what, really ultimately it's been left in their hands to determine what you should be paid. So
and these criteria, just to interject, these criteria aren't made up. This criteria comes from a manual published by CMS for the arbitrators of the IDREs to consider which QPA or which last best offer to accept. Thanks for letting me interject.
No, I love it, Seth. So you can see here, there's number 3 is the acuity of the services and the complexity. So that's where we're going to try and pull as much out of the chart notes, especially any sort of trauma, burn, any of that acuity information is really important to getting your offer accepted at the highest rate. But there's also some things here that are kind of more of that one and done that you can put into a can letter, like teaching status, case mix, your quality metrics. If you're a sole community hospital, a rural hospital, if you have, as I mentioned, trauma, burn centers, all of that goes into the cost to operate a hospital. And so as we're looking at a quasi-legal process, we want to include everything that helps our case and helps drives additional reimbursement in our favor. So another part of this, and another thing that we had to put into our workflow tool, is establishing reimbursement targets, or QPA. So we've talked about it. It's a bit elusive. And so this is where we find that the managed care team really comes into play and provides feedback as far as, what is our average commercial rate? What are we willing to accept on out-of-network claims? Again, we don't want to encourage providers not to contract by accepting lower than what, if they had contracted, they would be paying. So these are just some examples. One is a matrix where it's kind of based on the discount amount, what the goal is, greater than equal to 75%, but then also what a floor is there. And so this is what we use in the single case agreement environment to see if we can hit these targets. And then we know, yay, we got a single case agreement. It met the thresholds of our client, of the provider, and we can sign that and move on. However, when we don't hit these targets is when we have to evaluate the IDR process. Is it worth escalating at that point? And I show this matrix, but other things that are simpler is maybe 300% of Medicare, depending on your region, maybe 200% of Medicare, because that takes into account maybe an ER claim with a lot of imaging that's really not going to get 75% of bill charges. Another one simpler is maybe 65% of bill charges or 75% of bill charges, like you see in the table. Again, really working with your managed care team on what your average commercial reimbursement, contracted reimbursement rates look like. I think a big mistake is programming it at 100% of bill charges, because that's going to create a lot of false positives for your team working these. And, it's really not, you don't want to go to the QPA saying, I want 100% of bill charges. You really want to put together your case as well as kind of a reasonable offer based on the case itself.
I also think that you always need to be cognizant of the upfront cost. Again, as we referred to earlier, the IDR process can cost anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 up front. And you do get if you win, you do get a significant portion of those fees back. But again, it's outlaid for at least that couple of months on your card or however you paid on it. And then a couple $100 of admin fees never get refunded, because that's how CMS pays and creates the infrastructure for their adjudication. So you always have that floor of cost that you can't really back up on a single filing. You might have to consider batching.
Yeah, and I think also taking into consideration the strength of case. So we did a few trial runs with some cases that we thought were just not that strong, but hey, what the heck? Let's just see, admitting diagnosis is headache. There's just a lot of imaging. Maybe it was paid 30% of bill charges or even 15% of bill charges, but the strength just isn't there. So we put a few of those through just to see, and we did end up losing. But it was a good kind of trial and error just to see, test, is it worth the fees? Don't recommend just blanketing, sending everything that you have that qualifies for NSA for that reason. So as we mentioned about the cost of this, the resources, et cetera, it's really important to build payer-specific playbooks. So this really helps you track where to spend your time, where to spend your resources on the strongest cases with, knowing how the payers act, how to be the most efficient working with your payers. So again, we have certain payers that we just are never going to get past. They will never negotiate a single case agreement. So we know that. And so we have to evaluate every case like we're going to IDR versus spending all that time on the single case agreement and getting nowhere, knowing we have to go to IDR. So, is that right? I don't know. But again, it does help us with our resource management, knowing where to spend our time. Kind of pop up. And just also really understanding their delay tactics. They're all a little different. And I mentioned that you have to get it to the right department. So we have seen payers that they have just changed the email address to send it to. All of a sudden, no notification. So really being on top of that so we don't just be sending things and miss that timeline because they made a change or they had a delay tactic there. They may change their process, et cetera. Something else that we've found really critical just in the last year, we realized it was really important to develop relationships with the IDR entities. So these are third-party arbiters, right? They're in the middle. They're not on one side or the other. And we found that, building that relationship with them, they were able to communicate a lot of information back to us that was helpful, things that they were considering. They're also very on top of new rules and regulations coming down the pipeline. And so we found that to be very valuable as well. Versus we had I think Maximus this week just started their system kind of broke and they were blanket denying everything. But we didn't really have someone to get a hold of there. So, when we choose the IDRs that we have built those relationships. We feel like there's good back and forth communication.
Before we move on though, what was that bit there about federal IDR processes versus like state processes?
Thank
How
you.
does that factor in?
So the majority of the states utilize the federal IDR process, but we do have a handful of states that are a bifurcated process where there may be certain payers or, kind of a certain population that will go through the state IDR process, which is different. And I think the biggest one I've experienced is the Texas TDI state process. Seth, I know we've worked with the DMHC in California. It tends to be a lot.
California is a bifurcated model, so yeah, anything that's HMO tends to is covered through like Knox-Keene and goes through the DMHC, and the challenge would be with the ERISA commercial payers, which do go through the IDR because they're under ERISA, so they get lumped into the IDR process in this federal law.
And so we found that the federal IDR process is much more streamlined. It's very straightforward. The state processes have been very slow, a lot more challenging to navigate and get good responses or, kind of a tangible good, expedited response in the time frame. So when we prefer, if possible, to use the IDR, the federal IDR process. So based on the data, you can see these are the top payers where IDRs have been filed, with disputes have been filed with. So maybe not a huge surprise, United Healthcare is up there, Aetna. So this is where that kind of payer playbook also comes into play. A good example would be Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois on here. I know we're talking to the Mid-Atlantic states. So they have a different payment model, as those in Illinois know, and they pay once a year. And so you may win the IDR, but it's going to take you a really long time until that payment comes through. So that's just knowing, okay, is this worth our time? Is this worth the resources if we have an Illinois plan? You see a lot of various different anthems here. So, United Healthcare is a little simpler because it's one global entity, but when we're dealing with all of the Blue Crosses, they can really vary. They can change their department. They can change the email. They just being really familiar with all their various delay tactics and who to work with. I'd say also, developing relationships on the payer side. So it tends to be the same department, the same few people, negotiating these claims, these single case agreements. So it's good to know their names, know their email address, and know who to go to. So this is where the real strategic, thinking comes in. So, winning IDR cases isn't just about getting paid. It's really improving future negotiations, improving future outcomes and future reimbursement. And so every IDR case that you win really becomes intelligence for your organization. So you can start to see, what are the specialties, what are the services that we're having big wins on, where are we not having as big of wins that we're not winning as much, what payers are we doing well with, maybe which IDR entities tend to be ruling in our favor more than others. It's just really good information to have. And it's also, helps you see where the dollars are coming in. So what does success look like? In our experience now, 4 years in, we're seeing that about 85% of the NSA eligible claims are successfully negotiated to a single case agreement. So the large volumes are resolved in that single case, that spitball arbitration process. However, we're seeing that the high dollar claims, so 50% of the NSA dollars required that escalation to IDR. So really,
Yeah, that's a real interesting metric, especially when you consider, like, since the start of the NSA, I think they said a recent study said that it was 3.3 million IDRs filed, certainly several orders of magnitude above what they initially thought this process would result in. So yep, going straight to the end there.
delay tactics, right? And a lot of administrative costs, administrative time, administrative burden. So, what does success look like? Success looks like seeing a lot more hospital providers, hospital claims going through this IDR process, really making this leap to, untap this revenue that is sitting there. It's a process, and it takes, an experienced kind of model, but the dollars are there.
And I think to emphasize your point, the same study I was referring to was mentioning that basically only one, and it goes back to that earlier slide where you were talking about the different groups of people that were filing. Only about 1% of hospitals, like, off that list in most of the other states in the US are actually availing themselves of this process.
That's right. So we're just not seeing the hospital providers filing IDRs going through this process. So they're really just leaving this money on the table because at this point it's long timed out.
All right, strategy 5, evaluating build, buy, and partner decisions. So this is really how you can, as a provider, I assess according to your own context whether you would want to capitalize on this approach uh, by developing internal resources, going external, and understanding what the best choice is for you, because context matters here. One of the first aspects of context would just be, what is your current out of network volume? Um, Kaiser has facilities across the far west, and we're mostly out of network. So we're non-contracted. So our volume is quite high. Um, your mileage can vary, but that becomes an important part. The other aspect is available internal expertise. This isn't typical follow-up work. It might seem in the initial processes that it is, the kind of reacting to a denial, throwing out an offer, the open negotiation is pretty established collection follow-up work. The element that becomes complex is later on in the prepping and the filing for IDR. Liana, I'm just wondering, like, what's the average length of one of your IDR filings?
From kind of start to finish.
Hmm,
I think
yeah, like what you submit.
yep, we're averaging about 120, 160 days.
So that's how long it takes. What about like the page length of an actual submission? What comes into supporting docs and
Oh,
what gets filed?
we are pulling chart notes for every single submission. So, some of those chart notes are 100 pages, some of them are 1,000 pages. Again,
That's
we're
a
using
lot.
our tool to summarize the key components, but yeah, it's a big packet.
And that's part of what goes into technological infrastructure requirements. Anything that might help you, especially if your volume is high, might help you grapple with the load of preparing for that baseball-like arbitration and assembling your package to file, will help. Expected ROI for different approaches. Again, this is this dispute process requires upfront cost unless you manage to settle through open negotiation. There may be other strategies as well. You probably should consult your own counsel for that, but the different approaches really base off that upfront cost you have to expend to achieve potential returns later on. And finally, adapting and scaling as NSA volumes continue to grow. So as this form of collections ages, it's gotten more mature, people in the industry adapt, but don't feel like you've been left out or you're behind the eight ball. As we discussed with 1%, you're in you're in large company there. So one of the best things to think about is just start small, progress and improve over time, and scale as one gets their feet wet.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize more the expertise required to successfully recover this revenue. So we have found that really the same person, even with that starts it, needs to finish it. So they're the point of contact for the single case agreement. They're the point of contact as they get it through the IDR process. They're the point of contact for the payer as they're following up for that payment to be processed based on the IDR winning judgment. So really they need, the tech and the tools is great and it is helpful, but really it's that expertise, right? That quasi managed care negotiator type of experience, knowing to go back and forth, what to negotiate, who to go to really navigate these claims through the entire process.
And that's an important point because I know it helps to have one person with any kind of quick settlement, but the IDR to file an informal dispute resolution, you need to have the appropriate like service email, almost like a quasi like proof of service, just so that you're getting those notifications about objections and payment deadlines. And it probably does help to keep that centralized.
As centralized as possible, for sure. So as we talked about really, how to get started, the 3 imperatives for managing the out-of-network reimbursements. So as we mentioned, it really requires a dedicated out-of-network team, at least an individual to start that's really overseeing this, has the knowledge and the expertise of the processes, the timelines, and potentially the ability to coordinate identifying these claims up front in that first 30 days. Then applying, that technology, is coming up with some sort of workflow, whether it be manipulating your EMR system or maybe, kind of a side workflow tool just to help you with tracking the offers, the deadlines, the processes, etc., along with putting together that packet for submission. So we talked about some of those one and done things like including, your teaching status, your quality metrics, some of the things that you can just do one time and include in every single letter moving forward, at least for a year. And then thirdly, executing payer-specific strategies, knowing your payers, knowing where to go, developing those relationships so that you are meeting those deadlines and they don't pull some delay tactic on you, causing you to kind of lose out on this revenue. So I guess, how can you afford
Time
not
to open up
help,
for
Anna?
questions. Yeah.
One last thing I would mention is that we talked about claims subject to NSA throughout this process, but we've really found that even just all out of network claims, if you are developing an internal strategy, is best to put through here. They may not have the tight timelines, but really we're working with the same departments to negotiate a single case agreement, maybe just not under the tight timelines again, but the departments are set up the same. And so we're, the reference-based payers, et cetera, we're going for the same type of QPA targets, et cetera. So we've found that's the ultimate strategy is just to include all out of network, regardless of NSA.
And we do have a series of questions, so I'm going to start asking those questions and you can decide who you'd like to answer them. We are in the 4th year of NSA's out-of-network dispute process. What changes, if any, do you see on the horizon?
Wow. I'd say that at this point, we're kind of out of the embryonic and child stage of development, kind of moving into adolescence or young adulthood, if you can bear with my analogy. Um, Given the success in the IDR process, I would expect a payer reaction or some payer responses. There are several undefined areas of the law, especially I've seen payers uh, split denials where they will mark certain line items as NSA related, but deny like the other half as medical necessity. You might see some splits like that. Another element would be in payment and enforceability of those IDRE determinations. Some of that will go down, but I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a pain point and an escalating pain point.
Okay, thank you. What are some of the foreseeable problems with claim identification?
Oh, I think that comes particularly in paper, possibly with smaller payers. As Liana mentioned earlier, like I've seen one EOB that instead of using those codes, just used QPA on every line. And so there is a balance between what's there electronically to be scooped up, and what's there in paper. And paper slows the process.
And I think follow up to that question is, how does this work differ from typical claims follow-up processes?
I would say it's really the expertise. So in the typical claims follow-up processes, we would see maybe a follow-up representative be told no, and not where to go, or send it to to kind of the normal, let's call it United Healthcare billing department, and that's not the right place. That doesn't count. That doesn't stop the clock. So really having that knowledge of where to send it, as well as what rates are acceptable to accept. So they may be put in a position to sign a single case agreement, and they'll just sign it to get that payment in the door, but it's for a very low reimbursement amount that's not appropriate.
Thank you. And a little more lengthy question here. Regarding the payer-specific playbooks, who should own the creation and maintenance of these? Is this a full-time role? And a follow-up question to that is, how do you integrate playbook insights into your existing workflow without slowing down the process?
So I guess I'll start with the first part of that question. So who should own the payer-specific playbooks? Is it a full-time role? I think you really have to evaluate your volumes. I think for a lot of systems, this is a full-time role and can involve a team, an FTE, justify the FTEs, and they should house that knowledge. As far as the payer-specific playbooks, kind of in our workflow tool, that's where when we identify the payer, we're populating automatically where it should go, the phone numbers, the email addresses, and updating them as real time as possible. Let's see, as far as, not slowing down the workflow, it's really getting these isolated the day, as quickly as they post. So with some of our clients, we're doing weekly data extracts or data dumps of these claims, investigating them and trying to put them into the appropriate workflow or work queue within that first week or two, so that they are outside of the typical revenue cycle workflow.
Thank you. Yeah, we got a handful more questions here. Have you seen payers changing their approach?
Absolutely. So kind of the payer delay tactics. When we first started, we had a lot of disputes filed by the payers on our IDR winnings saying, well, no, it should only be the charges that were in the ER revenue code. And thankfully the IDR or the CMS stood by us, or I can't remember who's reviewed the dispute, but we won and they still had to pay. So they went through a series of disputing a lot of the IDR determinations. They did not win any of those, at least in our area and the claims that we've worked. And so I think that was a kind of an initial tactic. We've seen, a denial for fraud and abuse. So they're kind of reviewing all the regulations. And so we were able to overturn that. It was not fraud and abuse. So again, I think as Seth had alluded to, they're looking for any way to kind of get around this and paying these claims.
And one of the other things that's coming up too, it's a bit more public, is making sure that you're filing on NSA eligible claims, because as those payouts are coming through, you might get those determinations, but as Leanna is mentioning, payers aren't necessarily letting that lie. They're going to do their retrospective reviews. Often, like on any payment, payers have retrospective reviews to try to do takebacks.
Okay, wonderful. We have a couple questions here regarding IDR cases. What's your advice for smaller organizations that don't have many IDR cases to analyze?
I still think it's worth the money. It's usually millions of dollars. It can be relatively simple if you're looking at, 10 to 50 per month. That's in some high dollars, and just allocating your resources appropriately. I'd say that's probably more of a buy environment than a build. And not trying to be biased, but just kind of outsourcing that small volume to ensure that they do get managed. And I do think that can be millions of dollars there, which can be quite meaningful for a small facility.
And are there trends in the plans that are participating in the IDR process and winning in the 20% of disputes that favor the plan?
I think that goes to the strength of case. So we're assigning one, like a 1 through 3 strength of case based on the review of the chart notes and the admitting diagnosis. And so again, putting in an offer for 100% of billed charges on an ER admit of headache with a lot of imaging, it's just a losing case. And so I think as we're learning this process, learning where we're successful, you're going to test out some cases here, and just to see. At least that's what we found, is that we didn't have a strong case, or there wasn't a lot of documentation.
And none of that addresses the air ambulance stuff, which I'd have to go back and check.
Right.
Great question. We have 2 more questions that were submitted. When you refer to hospital claims going through the process, are only out-of-network emergency claims eligible, or are claims for any types of services rendered by an out-of-network facility eligible? For example, outpatient imaging and non-emergent surgery.
So typically, the services need to be tied to what is in the patient's control, or out of control. Sorry, that's what I meant, out of control. So what we're dealing with is typically emergent facility admits or ER visits. We haven't really discussed it here. There are provisions, continuity of care provisions in the NSA that might address that question a bit better on how to get reimbursement through for out-of-network physicians in network settings. That would be my response there. And if not, I can take that offline and research that further.
Yeah, so yes, if anyone would like more information on that, definitely reach out, or we'll make sure you get their contact information. And the last question we have here is, are single case agreements initiated prior to the claim being filed, or does the OON payer require the claim to be on file?
So the NSA process is kicked off by that EOB. I mean, as a provider, you can always reach out with a payer, but at that point, it's pretty much like a letter of agreement scenario, or your normal single case agreement. If you're doing open negotiation and failing of this process, it starts with that payment and the communication and invitation by the payer to engage in open negotiation.
Well, we have one last question. So we are getting SCA requests on claims that don't appear to be out of network. How are you verifying that these are truly out of network and fighting back as they don't keep sending non-appropriate out of network SCAs?
So I would assume that they are non-contracted. They may not be, emergent, out of their control that they ended up there, but they're there, but they're non-contracted. So I think that's where we find that including that population with your NSA, because a lot of times we're investigating claims only to find out they're not NSA, but they are out of network. But a lot of times they're going through that same process. You still want to get a single case agreement for the desired reimbursement rate that you've set. So that definitely ties into where we find that they really start to mingle together, minus the timelines.
Well, thank you everyone participating today for the outstanding questions. Please, you should be receiving an email to do a survey. Please take the time to do that. We appreciate that. The recording and the slides will be made available. And I would like to thank our 2 presenters today for an outstanding session. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Shelley. Nice to see you, Seth.
Bye-bye.